Well, hello world. It's me, your old pal Dan Shaheen. Welcome to Comic Book News. And today we're going to talk about big stuff, big fun, as in big comics. We're going to talk to Peter Maresca. Peter Maresca is the publisher of Sunday Press. And Sunday Press, took some of the treasures, unbelievably rich treasures that we have in the history, the early history, the birth of comics, that were literally just disposable, thrown away, recycled, never really thought about being preserved. Certainly never preserved in their original, glorious, gigantic format. What do you mean gigantic? Let's wait a minute. We've seen big comics. I've had big comics. You got right, we got some big books, but you got a book like this? Holy moly. This thing is gigantic. It's so big, it won't even fit inside the $1 Million Comics Cam, which, by the way, we're going to have the glorious return of. Today, the $1 Million Comics Cam. I can't fit a whole page in, but we're going to try. We're going to take a look at this stuff today. But most of all, we're going to talk about comics, man. We're going to talk about the glories of the past and, the wonders of the future, where we're going. Speaking of which, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. If you're watching this, you probably like comics, right? And if you like comics, I like you. And if you want to help me make stuff for you to watch about comics, please consider hitting like. Please consider hitting subscribe. And if you're even really serious, consider hitting that button that says join. And that's gonna, oh man, I don't even know how I could describe how great it would be to be joined and become one of the inner circle at Comic Book News. You can just click on that button and see the multiple tiers of membership. You can do that on your own time. For now, we're going to focus on our guest. Speaking of focus, though, as you know, you can comment. We can see your comments, but we're not looking at your comments until the end. So if you've got questions to ask for Peter or for me or whatever, save them to the end. You can chat amongst yourselves and comment throughout the show. And who knows, if I see something in there, I might throw it in there. But super chat or not, that doesn't mean it's going to get up on the screen during the conversation. But save it towards the end. And you'll see it there. So, all right, have I gone on enough? Are you guys ready to talk about big comics? Because I am. So let's bring in our guest, Peter Maresca from Sunday Press. Welcome to Comic Book News.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Awesome, Peter. So I know you through your brother, Phil. And Phil was a customer of mine at Hijinks Comics in San Jose back in the early 2000s. And in 2005, he mentioned to me, he said, hey, man, my brother, he likes old comic strips. You ever heard of Little Nemo? And I'm like, yeah, I love Little Nemo. We need that back in print in a big way. And little did I know.
In a big way when you said a big way?
I didn't know it was even possible to do what you did. So just tell me how'd you get into this thing? How'd you get into these kind of comics and how'd you get into publishing? Let's start with your love of comics and the old stuff.
Well, let's see. Back in my 20s, which is sometime in the Victorian age, I was working. I was really into Marvel comics, like a lot of people of the day, and that's how I spent a lot of my time and things I was collecting. And I was working as a land surveyor down in the Hudson Valley area in New York. And some guy says to me, there's an old guy, he's got to move out of his farmhouse. He says, he's got a lot of comics, you ought to go see him. I says, yeah, sure, great. Maybe he's got some early Marvels or Golden Age or whatever. I was not prepared for what I saw when I got there. This guy had been living in this small farmhouse all his life. It was a huge farm at one time, a couple hundred acres. And little by little, the subdivisions came in and bought up the farm. And, his family, the rest of his family was gone. And he had to move out. So he had to get rid of everything that he had. And he had a lot of stuff, mostly piled up everywhere all over his house. Not quite Collier Brothers style, but pretty close. But walking through all this mess, these little pathways that he had through all his junk in his house, and going up these wooden stairs, you get up to his little attic, and there's nothing there but piles of newspaper comic strips. And it turned out the guy, since he was a kid, he was really old at the time. I think he was 60. And to me, that was pretty old.
And what year was this approximately?
This was like 72, something like that, 73.
Okay.
So since he was a kid, which is sometime in the 20s, every Sunday his dad would go and get all of the New York Sunday newspapers. And at that time, there were probably 5 or 6 newspapers in New York, and whittled down year by year. And he would get the comic sections and read them and bring them up to the attic. So, and he had done that right to the week before I saw him. So all of the New York newspaper Sunday comic strips were piled up. And but they weren't necessarily in order. The guy was a little sloppy about everything in his life. And he would pull one off and say, oh, yeah, see, now there's Tarzan. This is when this happened to him. And, oh, yeah, this was when Dick Tracy, and here's the villain that he had. And he had all this stuff practically committed to memory.
So he was just a lover of the stories of
absolutely. The guy. This was, if you look around his place, there wasn't much else to his life besides reading these comic strips. And so I spent hours with the guy. And this was the first time I had ever seen Little Nemo. First time I had ever seen the original Flash Gordon by Alex Raymond. At this time, there were very few reprints that had been out, and they hadn't come my way in 1971 or 72. So my first introduction to this stuff was in the way it was originally presented. And I was just blown away. I said, it's way beyond what a lot of the stuff that's going on now is, certainly what a lot of the stuff in the newspaper was. And you could see a lot of the people who were drawing comic books got a lot of inspiration from these adventure strips and fantasy strips and so forth. So I spent hours and hours talking with the guy, and then came back the next day to talk more. And it turned out he had to sell the farm and go to a home, and he did not know what was going to happen to his comic strips. And he wanted them to have a good home, and I promised that they would. And this was 50 years ago. So I don't know. I think he'd be pretty happy with what happened to his collection, because much of it went into all of the books that I've been publishing.
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing because, at that time, even then, people started to know, oh, comic books could be worth something, right? And there was a collectible value to it and everything. But I mean, this was considered such ephemera, right? Like newsprint.
Oh yeah, you wrap the fish in it. Yeah.
Right. So there was no and reprints and collections of this stuff. It was basically unheard of in the era that it was published. And so how did it was it preserved? I mean, it had just been preserved through collectors like yourselves over the years and then reprinted in other smaller, inferior formats?
Yeah. Well, don't say, I don't want to say inferior. I mean, it turns out they're not as good, but it was what was available to do. Yeah. So that was.
Well, what were the complications in printing something this massive? Like, why hadn't it been done before?
Well, I think there were a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a bad idea, according to everybody I talked with. This was 2005, early 2005, and I realized it was the 100th anniversary of Little Nemo. And I said, something ought to be done. I'm looking at my collection. It's 100 years old, difficult to touch and handle. Another 100 years, it's just going to dissolve. It'll be gone. And the only place you'll be able to see it is if you can go to an archive or museum somewhere, and maybe with your white gloves on, take a chance to look at it. But I said, well, it really needs to be seen the way I was introduced to it, which was the original form when I saw it back in the 70s. Right. So I brought it to a bunch of publishers, and they all said, "Oh, it's very nice. Yeah, it won't sell. You can't do it."
I mean, it's meant to be read, right? It's not meant to be hung on a wall and looked at. Right. This was meant to be consumed and read and enjoyed. And
well, people would always ask me, what do I do with a book like this? Where do I keep it? So I suggested they keep it under the living room sofa, and then on Sunday morning, you pull it out and you look at it on the floor, which is the way I used to read comics when I was a kid.
Okay, well, let's real quickly, let's take a look. I'm going to try a little something here we call the $1 Million Comics Cam. I've never done this live before, so please forgive me, Peter. Yeah, please forgive me if this doesn't work out. But let's go check out what? The $1 Million Comics Cam. Oh, all right. So let's see what we got here. We got Little Nemo. Let's see. Turn off our $1 Million special effects. And I've got the real deal right here. I can't even fit the whole darn thing in the $1 Million Comics Cam, but I just want to give people an idea here. I'm going to just pull me solo for a second. The kind of scope that we're talking about. I mean, this thing is gigantic, but it's only when you can get your hands on it and get in and up close and look at these gorgeous colors. And I mean, Peter, these look, are you telling me like this was the level of color reproduction for comics in what, 1903?
Oh yeah, it's just absolutely amazing the amount of work that went into it. And the problem is with a lot of earlier editions, Little Nemo, first of all, when it was so small, a lot of the text you couldn't read without a magnifying glass. And the other thing was that the process that was done in the 80s, whenever this was done, you had to have a color separation. So you'd have to do layers of colors, and you couldn't really capture the detail of the screens and the little tiny dots and so forth that were done back in the early 1900s. But fortunately, right about the time I was trying to do this, printers were switching over from color separation to going directly from a colored PDF to the printing presses. So that enabled you to take a high resolution scan of these materials and have them reproduced with right down to the tiny little screen dots, exactly the way a newspaper page looked. It's also presented a lot of problems when we wanted to reproduce it full page, because the computers weren't up to it. The processing power that was needed using Photoshop and Quark, they were used. You'd make a comic book then, and you might have a file that was 15 or 20 megs, and these things are 200, 300 megs.
So how did these compare? Have you ever seen the original artwork for?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of it, but not quite a lot of it, but there's reasonable amount around. And
is it basically the same size, or is it larger?
Oh no, it's about 50% larger.
Even 50% larger.
Things are monsters. Yeah, the biggest book I've seen was a guy in France, Bernard Mahe, who actually did a collection of the original artwork full size, and that's just massive. You have a pickup truck to look at it.
It's really amazing, beautiful stuff. And like, so that you just blew my mind though, thinking about something 50% bigger. So Peter, I'm going to pitch to you the even more unsellable artist's edition version.
Yeah, it's out. It's been done.
It has been done at the 50% larger size. Where do I get that book?
I'm not sure if there were any left. They were about $600 or $700.
Oh
and
my God!
They came in a wooden crate.
Did you publish it?
Something to look at. No. It was done by a guy in France.
Okay, great. So fast forward now. So you collected, you found, you got into this stuff. You developed an appreciation for it, obviously, and a love for it. And nobody would publish it. And by 2005, you kind of decided, like, look, it's time. If nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. So
yeah, and I had a lot of encouragement for that. To back up a little bit, I had spent, since I moved out to the Bay Area, I spent time in the high-tech entertainment world. So doing stuff in CD-ROM, and then online entertainment and online animation, and a little bit of cartoons as well. And when the .com fell apart, I started doing stuff, experimenting with putting comics on mobile phone screens. If you remember the little tiny green screens that they used to have, that kind of stuff. Which all the more reasons said, you can't read comics like this. You've got to read them the way they're originally done. So I had a little bit of Photoshop knowledge from my days in the entertainment world, but knew absolutely nothing about book publishing. And I took the idea around. I said, well, let me talk to people who have done this and see how I can do it. So I spent a lot of time with Art Spiegelman trying to figure out. He had just done his No Towers book, which was like a board book, which is sort of regular tabloid size. Then you turn it over, and it's a bigger version that you could read vertically. And we said, well, maybe you can be like that. And I had made a mock-up of printing the pages at the full size. And we said, no, that's just the way it has to be. And at the time, I had been spending a lot of time in Europe working with publishers over there, doing their reproductions of American comic strips, both in Italy and France. And that's where I had gotten to meet Etienne Robal and Florence Sestak. And they had a company called Copyright. And they were doing a lot of reproducing American comic strips and translating them. And they had a designer there named Philippe Giometti, who was a big comics fan as well. And we had become friends over the years. So I'd met them back in the 70s. And he said, yeah, we could do this. Come on over. And a friend of mine, Farshid Baruka, who had a company called Comics USA in France, that he published hundreds and hundreds of comics.
Yes.
And he said, yeah, I'll give you a hand. Come on. So Philippe said, yeah, we'll have a case of wine and we'll do it in a weekend. Well, 10 days later, and about 3 cases of wine later, we're still working on this stuff because, like I say, the processing power that was needed, and you'd work on these Quark files and Photoshop files, and you'd get the processing for 20 minutes, and then boom, it would crash, and you're starting all over again. But so yeah, it was a little frustrating, and at some time we were ready to just jump out the window. But Farshid was living on the 21st floor, so that was not a good idea. But we did get it done, and then the question was, okay, we got to get it printed. Oh, funny thing was, just when we finished up, we got the last of the file. Philippe says, okay, we're done. What's your ISBN? I said, what's an ISBN? He said, what are you, crazy? You can't make a book without an ISBN. You got to send away for them, and it takes 2 weeks, and you never meet the deadline. But fortunately, that was also with the things that were happening on the internet. You could then buy your ISBN online and get it shipped to you immediately. And that had happened like within a couple of months. This company started doing that. So we were able to get our ISBN and plug it into the book and get off the printers. And my wife, who had done a lot of high-tech publishing, I said, I had to have the book printed in Asia, because one of the things we insisted on was that when you open it up, it would lie flat, so you didn't have that big curve in the middle. In order to do that, they don't have any presses and any machines that could do that kind of binding, that kind of signature binding where it would lay flat. It has to be done mostly by hand. And there was a place in Singapore and a place in China that could do it at that time. Now there's lots of other people that'll do it. And so I got it was Françoise Mouly, Art's wife, who had been working with this publisher in Singapore. And she says, well, I'll talk to them. We'll work it out. We'll get you some credit and get started. So like my wife said, she says, well, they're going to get the colors wrong. You have to go over there. So I would go over for the press check, and it was, 72, 76 hours, something like that, nonstop, to get all these things printed.
So tell me about the colors. Let's talk for a second about the colors, because, well, there's no way any of the, I don't even know, how did they do color separations in that era? Like when these were printed, how did they do the color? It was a 4-color press, so obviously they had to do color seps, but were they hand cut, separate? Like what?
Well, they would have screens that they would use that would have patterns in it, and they would be able to use screens and create these halftones. And I don't know how true it is, but it is true that Winsor McCay used to go down to the presses and work with the guys to get the colors right. And he had them actually, according to a story that I heard, had them create a new kind of yellow, because the yellow that was used in comic strips at the time was a much paler yellow. And he wanted a new kind of ink where the yellow would just pop off the page. And they did it. And you look at some of the early Little Nemo pages, and they were printed with such quality and such good inks that a lot of the colors are still really vibrant, particularly the ones in the New York Herald.
I had heard that the term yellow journalism actually came from the Yellow Kid comics that were printed in that era.
Right. That was because Hearst and Pulitzer. Pulitzer first started with the Yellow Kid. It was Outcult who was working for Pulitzer at the time. And the big idea about the Yellow Kid was not that it was the first comic strip, but it was the first comic strip that appeared regularly with the same character. So a character that people could identify with, and particularly at that time, that the working class could identify with and the immigrants could identify with. And Pulitzer realized that this is how he sold his newspapers to the growing immigrant, it's turn of the century, the growing immigrant population in New York that didn't read a lot of English, but they could make it through these comics. And they loved seeing these really huge color comic strips. When Hearst came in from San Francisco to New York, he saw what Pulitzer was doing and said, well, I'll just hire all his people away. Just like what happened in the movie Citizen Kane, based on Hearst. He'd just go and hire all the people away from the competition. So he hired Outcult away from Pulitzer to have him do his own version of Yellow Kid. And then at that point, Pulitzer said, I'm not going to lose the Yellow Kid. I own this name. So he got another staff artist, George Lukes, to do the Yellow Kid. And Outcult was doing the Yellow Kid for Hearst. So at that time, there were two different Yellow Kids going on at the same time. And all of the newspaper trucks would drive around with big signs on them and little artwork that said, we have the Yellow Kid. We have the original Yellow Kid. We have the original artist of the Yellow Kid. And someone made the comment, and I think it might have been the Times or someone else that says, this isn't really newspapers. This isn't journalism. This is Yellow Kid journalism. And that got shortened to yellow journalism. And that was the term that was used for cheap papers that were just, printing anything just to sell newspapers, and they didn't care about journalism, which was not necessarily true, but that's what the papers said who didn't have the Yellow Kid.
Right. Well, and I mean, almost a parallel to today's sensationalistic media, and
that never goes away. The medium changes, but the sensibility doesn't go away.
Okay, so talk about Winsor McCay for a second too, because is that guy did he just drop in from outer space, or
Well, he started out doing. He's born in Canada, then they moved to Michigan for a while, and he started out drawing posters for sideshows and carnivals and things like that.
Oh.
And got to
I'd
do
like to see those.
Yeah. There's not much around, although what is around is some of the advertising work that he did back in the teens, and it's the fonts that he would use and the style of artwork was very reminiscent of those types of posters to try and drag people in off the street, very eye catching. So he did his first comic strip in Cincinnati, the Tales of the Jungle Imp, and then got a job and moved to New York City, got a job there, did a bunch of little daily strips, and did the Little Sammy Sneeze, which was his first regular character hit. And from that came Little Nemo, and then it just exploded. But here was a guy, when you look at that was his first regular character. And that book also contains his other regular character, which was Hungry Henrietta, and that was done at the same time. And in the newspapers in New York, Hungry Henrietta would actually appear on the reverse of Little Sammy Sneeze, so you get 2 for 1.
And Little Sammy Sneeze, fun gag, get kids a big sneezer, love it. It's fun.
It's kind of a one-note joke, really, and it's very static, very much like a theatrical performance. We've got a room of people doing it, and then the next panel, and then things would change a little bit, but the scene would be the same. And then you get the payoff in the last panel with the big sneeze. Sure.
And so then how do you go from that to what we're seeing in Little Nemo? Because it's just, it's amazing. It's not, I mean, for a brand new medium, he was creating stuff at such a high level, the stories, the richness of the themes and the metaphors, but even the light touch that he had to it, it's as brilliant as any comic since then. And I don't know that anybody's outdone it, and certainly not at this kind of scale.
Yeah. Well, look at that background that you have there from a Little Nemo comic strip.
Yeah.
He did all that stuff, and I talked to a guy back in the 70s who used to work with him in the 20s and 30s. And he never used a straight edge, never used a compass. All that stuff was done freehand. And he had a vaudeville show that he would do at night. At the same time he was doing Little Nemo and creating animated cartoons, he was doing a vaudeville show. And
well, and when you say,
where people would call things out and he'd draw it in seconds.
but wait a minute, when you say creating animated cartoons, you don't, because like I could create some animated. We're talking about like inventing, like creating the very first animated cartoons ever, right? I mean, Gertie the
first commercially successful animated cartoon, which was his Gertie the Dinosaur, and he would actually take that out to vaudeville theaters and do his routine where he would stand there, and as the film was going, make believe he was a part of the action, and he would throw things to Gertie and talk to Gertie, and Gertie would respond.
Yeah. And
so that became a big. But again, all of that was drawn. That was before they used cells for animation. So all the backgrounds were drawn on every single page.
That's what I was just about to ask. That's what I had heard and thought. So, like, for anybody, a lot of people that watch cartoons, like my wife, they don't think about the mechanics of how it's done, nor should they, right? They shouldn't have to. But when you think about having to draw every background of every frame in every, it's just amazing. And was he doing all the in-betweening and every frame of animation?
Yeah, well, there's no such thing as in-betweening at the time. It was just every frame was done, yeah.
Amazing. That guy, like I said, just like from outer space. I don't know how you get, because the dream symbolism and stuff that he used in Little Nemo is, I mean, it's echoing to this day. It's going to be referenced for all time. Some of his icon. I don't have any pages here. I'll show the covers. Like I said,
if people want to go to the website, there are sample pages for all the different books.
Yeah.
So you can go through the books, and then there's a sample page button, and you can look at all the pages for the different books.
Okay, so first run of Little Nemo Volume 1. How many did you print?
Well, it was weird because I didn't know what to print, and I just looked at my bank account, what was left over from my work days. I said, well, I have enough money to print 5,000, so I'll print 5,000. And I talked to other people after I'd already committed. You know, Bud Plant was one of the guys, because Bud Plant sells a lot of this stuff, this specialty great art stuff. And he said, geez, I hate to tell you, but never going to sell 5,000 copies of those. He said 1,000 would be good if you could sell 1,000 of them. I said, oh crap, what am I going to do with this? Then I go to the warehouse and I see 2 trailer trucks coming in, unloading stuff. My God, what am I going to do with this stuff? So at the time I was talking with a friend of mine in New York, and she said, you know, why don't I give it to my friend Steve Heller, who's the art director at the New York Times Magazine. I forget if it was the art director or editor. I think it was the art director. And I said, great, anybody. I got to get the word out here. So he said, yeah, this is great. I like Little Nemo. And you know what? I know a woman, Sarah Boxer, who's a freelancer. She works for the Times, and she really loves Little Nemo. Let me give it to her. So we sent her a copy of the book. And I never heard back from them. So I assumed they're going to, do a little blurb somewhere or something. And then I'm sitting at the computer, and the email, gives a little ding when an email comes in. And at the time, I was selling 2 or 3 books a day. So I says, oh, this is good. 12 years, I'll have this stuff sold. But I was perfectly happy with that the word was getting out there and people were seeing it. And then I hear a ding, ding. Oh, another book sold. And then ding, ding, ding. Wow, 3 books sold. And then it was ding, 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 ding. And it was nonstop dinging. And I said, what's going on here? So I did a little search, and turns out that was the hour at which the New York Times online had been had just gone to press, or had just been made available. It came out the day before the edition came out. So it was published on the anniversary of Little Nemo, which is what they like. And she brought her story to the editor, said, this is great, 100th anniversary, let's make a big deal out of it. So they put it full page on the cover of the art section with full color illustrations, with little full color call out on the front page of the newspaper. So it was a pretty amazing thing. And then next thing I know is 3 months later, it was all sold out. And this was, you got to remember, I didn't know anything about the business. I didn't have a distributor. I talked to one of the guys at Diamond, and they say, yeah, we'll take a couple of boxes and we'll see how it goes. And then once the Times came out, then other people wanted to review the book. Publishers were, distributors were calling me to get it distributed. And I said, well, that's easy. You just make a book, give it to the New York Times, and then it sells out.
Yeah, sure, right. And they put it on the cover, and
Because
yeah.
I had no idea how this stuff works. Of course, it doesn't. It's not that easy, but all of it was from my having the collection, from the 100th anniversary, from the technology changing so that one person could actually do a book, to the technology where someone would see a review online and click a button and buy it from your website, and all of this stuff was relatively new. And so it was a matter of just having everything at the right time.
I mean, how amazing that McCay was like 100 years ahead of his time, as far as like it took 100 years to catch up to be able to do justice to what he was putting out weekly. Well, it literally did.
And it wasn't a big hit at the time, but it always had great critical appreciation. And then in the 60s, there was a reproduction came out in Europe, and there was a show at the Louvre on Winsor McCay's work. And so it had been started to get really appreciated before that time. It was, let's see, Woody Gelman's book, his Little Nemo book, came out in the early 70s. So there were people beginning to understand what this guy was about, but you didn't really get the message until you saw it full page. These people who did museum shows, people like Woody Gelman, who had a huge collection of Little Nemo original art, they got it because they saw it at the size. And that's really what
I mean, if you cared about Little Nemo at all, and if you ever wanted to read it, and you ever see this book, you just go like, of course, this is the only way it could ever and should ever be collected. Did you take it to Fantagraphics, the idea too?
Yeah, Gary Groth. I took it to Gary Groth, and he said, yeah, we already did the Nemo. At that time, I had a dummy. And he said, well, we already did it. And I don't know if we could sell a book this big, and but it's nice, and if it happens, let me know. And then I'm debuting the thing at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2005, and he says, why didn't you take this to me? I said, geez, I must have been stoned that day. But it's a certain thing where when somebody explains it to you, in fact, I never had the demo to show Gary. I just explained to him the idea, and it makes all the difference when you see it.
Oh, yeah. No, that would be all the difference, right? It's like, it's only when you see it in real life. I maybe had seen a couple of pages, maybe in a museum or something like that, and just see it and to imagine like paying, I don't know, would you pay a nickel for a newspaper on Sunday and you get this amazing thing?
Come virtually for free every week.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
The great thing about the success of the Little Nemo book, aside from the fact that it got people to understand how comic reprints ought to be done, and since Little Nemo came out, it really sort of changed how comic reprints were made, and there was a lot more attention paid to the quality of the reproduction and the color and all that stuff. But the great thing about it being a success was that I then had the ability to go and do more things that maybe weren't as popular as Little Nemo. They weren't going to break out of the comics ghetto like Little Nemo did, and it introduced me to a whole new group of fans. I got a note from Chris Ware shortly after Nemo came out, or 6 months later, and he says, I'd really love to do something like this with Gasoline Alley. Do you think you could do it? And I'll design it. I says, no. Do I want to do a book designed by Chris Ware? I said, no, of course I want to do that. So that was the Sundays with Walt and Skeezix. And what Chris did is I had contacted Drawn and Quarterly. They had just started doing the daily Walt and Skeezix with Chris. And they said, well, we really don't have any plan on doing the Sundays, and your big books look so great. So yeah, go ahead. Why don't you and Chris do that? And go ahead and keep it the same design that we use for the daily strips. So it really makes it part of that family, even though it's not the same publisher.
So tell me about Walt and Skeezix. Like, this is something when I see it, and I've heard of it, and I've seen this book, and I look at it, I go, this is gorgeous, beautiful stuff. It's not something I'm familiar with at all. And as far as like, it's not, in my way, it's not like a memorable, famous comic strip in my, limited understanding. So tell me more about it. And like, is this primarily more of a Canadian popular in Canada, or was it this?
No, this was from Chicago, and at this up in this till this time, this was like 1920 when the Gasoline Alley first started coming out.
Yeah.
And at that point, the most popular comic strips were pretty crude humor. I mean, they were great and funny. Katzenjammer Kids and Bringing Up Father and Buster Brown. And it was a lot of anti-authoritarian comics, a lot of poking fun at the society. Much of it was very urban because it all came out of New York City or Philadelphia. And Chicago, the Chicago Tribune started doing something different. They started getting into something that was more what was called, I forget the term that Frank King used. It's basically family comics.
Yeah.
Where let's take a look at how can we make, put a mirror up to how people are really living. Not people who are living in rich fancy places in New York, or people who are living in back alleys of cities, but just how sort of normal people live. And so that's how Frank King and Gasoline Alley started. It started on the automobile section of the Detroit News.
Okay, so this is where I'm confused.
So why a Gasoline Alley? Where's the gasoline?
But where's Gasoline Alley? Like, that name actually I've heard of and means something to me. And when I saw this book, I go like, what is this? Is this separate? Is it different?
Well, and of course, back in those days, and a lot of towns still have them. You'd have your regular street, and then you'd have an alley that the two streets would back up on, and that's where people would have their garages, and their backyards would butt up against the alley. And there was Frank King actually had friends who would live in this sort of community, and Walt Wallet and his buddies had this place where they would work on cars. And they would make jokes about the cars and troubles they had with the cars. And it was done in an alley, and they just sort of nicknamed the alley Gasoline Alley because of the cars that were being worked on there. And then from that, the story began to become more about the people than about the cars. And Frank King just had this wonderful sense of how people worked, how people interacted with each other, how families and friends interacted with each other. Yeah. And he was able to present that in a way that really hadn't been shown in comics, hadn't really been shown much in novels and stories at that time. So he really did get this beautiful presentation of Americana that had never been seen before in comic strips. And and each Sunday, there'd be a continued story of what would happen in the life of Walt and his friends. But every Sunday would be a story about a day in the life of Walt and his son Skeezix.
And that was the title of the Sunday strip. Was that, or was it Gasoline Alley?
Gasoline Alley. I went to the Chicago Tribune because I wanted to use the name Gasoline Alley.
Yeah. Okay.
They said, "Oh, our comic strip." It was shortly after they had done not shortly after, but they had done the big Dick Tracy deal with Warren Beatty, and they said, well, our characters are going to be these huge movies, and we're going to make a ton of money. So I went to them with this book idea that might, if everything goes well, it might make them a few $1,000s in royalties. Right. And they looked at me like I was just some kind of guy that wanted to squeegee their windshield. It was like, don't bother me. Well, they didn't really say that, but they just kept sort of putting me off, and then kicking me down the chain to where I was talking to one of the mail boys in Los Angeles, and I just forget it. And then Chris said, "Well, why don't we just do what we did with Walt and Skeezix? Is if you can't get the Gasoline Alley trademark, don't use it, and you don't have to use it. And people already know what the Walt and Skeezix is. So that's the direction we went in. Since then, the Chicago Tribune and all the other syndicates have realized it's important to have their characters seen with the original names. And Chicago Tribune and other places like King Features, they've all been really cooperative and helpful, and have encouraged publishers to use their trademarks and use their titles, and made deals that make it possible for small publishers to do this. Okay.
That explains everything, Peter, because honestly, it was just commercially confusing to me as a consumer. Like, if it had said like the Sundays of Gasoline Alley by Frank King or whatever, that would have meant something more to me, I think. And maybe because you mentioned before this talk that this one, it didn't sell as well as Nemo. Let's put it that way.
Well, no, nothing would ever sell as well as Nemo, but it did okay. But it took 10 or 12 years to do okay, as opposed to Nemo right out the gate.
Sure.
So yeah, Gasoline Alley sold okay, and then as the years went on, as there were other opportunities for people to buy newspaper strips, and so the print runs I've been doing now are much lower, but still enough to break even. And on a good book, I'll make $7.50 an hour.
If you can beat, oh man, that's really good money compared to YouTuber money. Trust me. Trust me on this one.
Well, that's what I'm saying. And my wife says the same thing. Play with your little comics. Don't touch the retirement savings. I'll keep making books.
Well, I'm just gonna pop up a bunch of different books that you've published, okay? And we'll talk about the ones. This is one I want to get back to for a second because you told me this is one of your favorites.
Yeah, that I think is the most important one. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's come back to that in a second. This one looks really interesting. These are many books that I just don't have A, the budget, B, the ceiling height on my bookshelf to make all of the Sunday Press books reasonable. We got Walton Skizix, Little Nemo. This one I wish I had some interior pages because this was some beautiful stuff when I was looking at this.
Yeah, again, you can go to the website and there's some great pages in there.
Yeah, and then let's just crazy. Oh, this one's got Gasoline Alley on the cover.
Yeah, that was the guy who created Gasoline Alley, Frank King, and something that Chris Ware had turned me on to a lot of the old stuff that he had done before he did Gasoline Alley. So I decided to do a collection of that, and Chris helped me edit it and put a nice little introduction on there.
Okay, great, awesome, man. I'm a big Chris Ware fan too, and I know he loves this old stuff. Are you a fan of contemporary comics as well?
Oh yeah, not so much the superhero and adventure stuff, but the graphic novel stuff, and a lot of a lot of historical fiction stuff.
Did you read the new Joe Sacco book this year?
Yes,
Paying the Land. Excellent,
really
excellent.
Yeah.
Dick Tracy, you brought up a second ago. And I just love this cover. Tell me about your designer and just
Philippe. Well, I mentioned before he used to work with a company called Futuropolis as a sort of groundbreaking comics publisher in Europe. That they really took comics to a new level. At that point, the comics in Europe were mostly reprinting things from magazines like Tintin and doing Asterix, and there were a couple of companies that were doing interesting stuff, but most of it came from magazines like Metal Hurlant, and then they would take the heavy metal started in France, and they would take collections of those things. But Futuropolis looked to old and new artists in putting together really interesting collections and bringing comic artists to the public that had never been seen before. People who loved the stuff and were just inventing all sorts of new ways to use the medium. But Futuropolis gave them that outlet. And Philippe was one of their book designers. And like I said, I'd worked with him a lot on reproduction. And he's a guy who is a rare combination of knowing and loving comics and having a really brilliant, very modern, very timeless design sense.
This just knocks me out. I love this.
So it captures the spirit of the strip, but at the same time, if you never knew Dick Tracy and you saw that as a poster, you'd say, that's a beautiful thing.
That's cool. Yeah, you want to look at that. You want to read that for sure.
And the same thing with the White Boy cover, coming out of that line as well. So
let's talk for a second. Let's go to Seeger and talk about Popeye a little bit and Thimblething, because Popeye to me is important. I don't know if you noticed our theme song on the way in.
Oh yeah.
I just love Popeye. I was raised on Popeye cartoons.
Oh yeah.
So many great Popeye cartoons that are in the public domain now too. So I've tried to play clips from those as much as possible. But he's been expunged from, like, he was a mainstay, like he was one of the early, you talk about the Yellow Kid, right? But like, okay, Yellow Kid was the prototype of what he was, the whatever, the Big Bop or something, but the Elvis Presley had to be Popeye, right? What do you like? I mean, he was a mega superstar crossing over. Tell me a little bit about Popeye and about Thimble Theater.
Oh yeah, Popeye is where Thimble Theater started, and yeah, Sagar was this incredible combination of a really good storyteller and a really good gag writer, and the characters he came up with were just really hilarious and multi-dimensional, more so than a lot of the comic strip characters. So he started doing a thing called Thimble Theater, and it got its name because there was a guy named, I think it was Ed Whalen, who was doing a thing for the Hearst papers in Chicago, and he went off to, and what that was is it was a little movie that was made into a 12-panel comic strip that would appear on a half-page newspaper, and each one there was a different title of the movie. And he left the paper and they wanted to come up with something to replace it. So Sagar had at that time been doing other comic strips. He'd been working on a Charlie Chaplin comic strip. And I don't know if I have my chronology right. But anyway, he was brought over to do this strip that replaced or was a new version of the Minute Movies. And he called it the Thimble Theater. And it was actually a theatrical performance in 6 panels. And it would have a cast of characters. On the top, it would say, Olive Oil as Miss So-and-so, Ham Gravy as her impatient lover. And so they would do to this sort of melodramatic theatrical performance using his comic strip characters as the actors playing different characters within the story. So there was a story within the story.
Yeah.
So then after a while, the characters became so interesting that he moved on to create stories about these characters like Olive Oil and her brother Castor Oil and Ham Gravy. And then who was the other one? Cylinder Oil. And so there's the whole oil family. And so they developed these adventure stories using these characters.
Yeah.
And it was in one of these stories that Popeye first appeared.
And I mean, he was the Fonz to the Happy Days of Thimble Theater, right? Like he was
just the coolest guy. Yeah.
But I mean, took over in the sense that like Thimble Theater is long forgotten.
Really, that's what everybody tuned into to see Popeye.
And it was this character that like debuted in like, when did Popeye himself debut? In the teens, right? Like
Popeye was, I believe, 29.
Okay, well, all right, later.
And by that time, Thimble Theater had been around for 10 years. Okay.
But even by the time I was a kid, well into the 80s, I mean, Popeye was still a thing. Like Popeye was a brand name. Popeye cartoons were playing each and every day all over the world, everywhere. Yeah, and somewhere along the line, they decided that like a fist fighting sailor who smokes all the time maybe is not appropriate for it.
Yeah, so they cleaned them up quite a bit. Yeah, it wasn't quite as violent. But when I was a kid watching them on TV, I had no idea that this is stuff that my father used to watch when he was in movie theaters. Yes. I didn't know that. I thought they made that for us for TV.
Well, and then what I love too, what you just mentioned about the Thimble Theater and them being like actors, is that's how some of the Popeye movies ended up being, like especially the Sinbad ones.
Oh yeah,
the Sinbad and Alibaba, where Bluto, it's Bluto, but he's playing Sinbad, right? And they're just sort of like playing these roles, but they have their essential characteristics as characters. And then to take Seeger's character and then put it into Fleischer's hands for animation, and what they then brought to it.
Yeah, what a brilliant combination. Yeah.
And with the vocal improvisations and everything that layered onto Popeye and became this thing. And now Popeye's kind of gone and forgotten a little bit, except for the chicken. I'm kind of sad about that. So what's
part
next?
Of it was that without the gruffness, without the smoking, without the violence and the punching and the fights, he's a less interesting character. And because that really, for some reason, I don't know, maybe it did mess up a lot of kids, but there's a lot of messed up kids in their 20s now that never saw Popeye. So I can't blame it on Popeye.
I watch it. I've been watching them over and over with my 4-year-old daughter. I watch them. And they are just a symphony. Even the ones into the 50s. The Fleischer ones were great, but even the later ones
they did some nice. The Paramount Studios did some nice stuff in the 40s and 50s.
They really did. I mean, and they're just a symphony of violence. It's nothing but punches in the face from beginning to end of that thing. And the climax, the spinach climax of each episode, it's fun to watch with a little kid. But so the importance that what's amazing to me is just that goes all the way back as far as it goes. And some of these things, we talked about this a little bit before the show started, is that the height and the quality, when you look at these newspaper stories from comics from over 100 years ago, right? And then even you go into the 50s, they got kind of smaller half page, but still we had Prince Valiant and it has just gone smaller and smaller with artwork that is just less and less, to the point where it's, I don't want to say Kathy and Dilbert aren't as artistically valid as Little Nemo. Wait, no, I am going to say that. Wait, no, they're not, right? They are not. Tell me about this. Where do we lose? Like, why? I know these guys were superstars, the cartoonists of the time. I mean,
you look at some of the stuff in the Society as Nick's books, and the cartoonists would do these jams, and there'd be photographs of the cartoonists on the top page as part of the logo with their names underneath. So people knew who these people were, and they were big stars.
Yeah, it's hard to even think of, like, at a time when, and today when moving pictures and everything, like, I'm streaming live to whoever wants to watch anywhere in the world, but like the limited lens we had and just the ability to have like a color comic strip on Sunday back then, and what that meant to people, like and to have something as rich as like what McCay would have to put in there. I don't know. I just look at it and I go, what happened? I thought we were more sophisticated now as a society. Why have our tastes become so much less sophisticated in the mass popular culture?
Yeah, well, there isn't the demand that was. There was in the 1930s and 40s, there were Sunday newspaper comic sections that were 32 pages. So you'd get 60 or 70 comic strips in there. And it was a whole morning's entertainment. But on Sunday morning, there was religious programs and the farm report. So when you're a kid, this is what you had.
Yeah,
and you would tell your parents to buy the Sunday newspaper that had the most comic strips, that had the comic strips you liked. So it became really important to the comic strips. The New York Daily News, the Sunday News in New York, up until a few weeks ago, or a few years ago, they would wrap the entire Sunday newspaper inside the comics. So what you saw on the newspaper rack was not the front page.
Yeah, no.
You saw Dick Tracy. So,
to this day, newspapers are still put Sunday newspapers off, and maybe not anymore. I don't know who buys newspapers anymore, but like it was a thing even into my youth. The San Jose Mercury News might have been an anomaly. They had a fairly big comic section. Mm-hmm. But then even then, just the restrictions placed on syndicated comics, the formats, the sizes, like, gosh, let alone being able to get could you imagine what Bill Watterson could have done if you gave him a full newspaper page every week?
Well, he refused to do anything. Usually what the newspapers do is they have the 3 tiers, and the top tier is expendable. So there's like a one panel gag and a logo. And because a lot of the people wanted to do it as a third of a page. And he refused. And that's one of the reasons why he just stopped doing the strip, was because he didn't want to wrestle.
Well, when he came back he went on his hiatus, and he made as a condition when he came back that it was going to be this new format, this tabloid format, where they would not have the disposable. They couldn't do it vertically if they wanted or whatever. He's like, just give me a block. I'm an artist. Are you kidding me? You're going to chop it up so you can put ham ads or whatever, You're going to break up Calvin and Hobbes. People are here to see the Calvin and Hobbes, so give him the right space, and you'll sell more papers and sell more ads.
And when Opus came back, it was the same thing, and that's why a lot of newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle was one of them. They didn't have it in the newspaper section because the format that he demanded wasn't going to go there in the section that they had out. So they put it in a different part of the newspaper. Yeah,
that's a shame if a newspaper would make a decision like that, especially considering nowadays how many options you have for layouts digitally and whatnot.
Yeah.
Like they could
Well,
make
you know,
it work.
it's a chicken and an egg. People aren't going to ask for it because they don't know what it's like. But if they saw it, they might be interested in it and buy that paper. But paper's not going to take a chance. They have a hard enough time.
It seemed like not a lot of cartoonists took advantage of it. I think Wiley and Non Sequitur and a couple of other cartoonists took advantage of that format change and put out their Sunday form, but many just sort of kept doing it the way it's always been.
Patrick McDonald does a good job of experimenting and very often paying homage to the earlier strips, Crazy Cat,
right.
Nemo, and other things.
Okay, yeah, talk about a couple other books. You got the Milt Gross book was fairly recently.
New one. And Gross is a great example of the sort of transition from the old comics to the new comics. His humor came out of the vaudeville and the Jewish comics of the vaudeville era, just like Marx Brothers and a lot of others. And his stuff had the sort of frenetic slapstick humor that was found on the vaudeville stage, but he also, in his earliest work, incorporated the Yiddish dialect, and which added a lot to the humor and a lot to the sort of the mystery and fun of it is the playing with the language that he heard when he was a kid on the east side of New York.
And I never made this connection. It's pretty obvious, I think, probably in hindsight, that like Harvey Kurtzman must have been.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And when you look at a lot of these the strips again, the Sunday Press Facebook page just has a new like 18-page section of all of these Milt Gross stuff, and you look at it and you go, yeah, I saw that in Mad Magazine.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is Harvey Kurtzman, and right down to the Yiddish vocalisms and whatever that you're talking about too. Right? Yeah. Okay, I got one more here. A personal fave of mine is Rube Goldberg, another one of those guys who was like kind of like a superstar of his day and age. Oh, yeah. Right.
And he was a superstar before he even had his inventions out.
So tell me a little bit about this guy.
Like Winsor McCay and a lot of other people, his artistic career started as a sign painter, although his father wanted him to be an engineer. So he went to Berkeley to study engineering, but his big love was cartooning. And he came up with this idea of foolish questions. So the way the story went was that somebody had fallen out of the second story building and he was lying on the ground and somebody went up to him and said, "Are you all right?" And it just would be a stupid question. The guy said, "No, I just fell out of the building." So he said, "No, the answer would be, are you all right?" "Yeah, yes, sure. I'm just, lying here watching the birds go by or something." And so he'd come up with a really dumb answer to a really dumb question, which was picked up later from Mad Magazine.
This is Al Jaffe, right? That's snappy answers to stupid questions.
Yeah. And I spoke with Jaffe, and he said that he had no real, he didn't really remember when this came out before Jaffe was born, when that strips first started. But he said he had no real knowledge of that particular strip, but he looks at it and said, it must have been in the back of my mind. I must have seen it.
Yeah, come on. Yeah. All right, I'll give it up to Jaffe. He's great. He's done plenty on his own since then, so we'll give it up to him. So what's next on the radar for Sunday Press, Peter? Oh, wait a minute. Let's talk a little bit about your relationship with IDW.
Oh, yeah. It was a couple of years ago. And that's the other weird thing, is that I've been doing everything. Find the pages, scan the pages, put the book together in InDesign, make the PDFs, go to the printer, come back, get the books, ship them out to distributors, send books out to regular customers. And I said, I'm getting a little old for carrying 40-pound boxes of books to the post office, and I'm tired of doing the business because I'm not that good at it. I got lucky early on, but I'm not really good at marketing. I don't know anything about doing this stuff. So that's when I started shopping around. And at the time, IDW had friends who were working there, people I'd known for years. And they were really excited about getting the line in. So I put together a deal with them where they would handle all of the distribution. And then there would be a decision made with a new title. So I'd come up with an idea, and they always have first option to publish it. And if they want to publish it, they'll do the publishing, and I'll just take a royalty from that. Or if they said, well, yeah, we're not really interested in that, we're not sure if it'll sell well enough, then I'll take on all the publishing and expenses, and then
I see. Sort of a right of first refusal type deal.
Yeah. So it's sort of a hybrid deal, but essentially they take the whole line. And since they picked up the line, a lot of the old books have been selling better than they were when when I was hawking them myself. So.
And so how did you know much about how your stuff sells in the book channel compared to, say, the direct market comics channel?
It's really hard to say because I don't get the numbers. I mean, I know when I was selling through Diamond, I would know how many books I would sell through Diamond, or how many books I would sell through Ingram, or how many books I would sell personally on the website. So that's all I knew, but I didn't know how many of them were getting into main stores, getting just sold on Amazon, getting into the bookstores, the comic book stores. Diamond would get all the stuff into the comic book stores, but sometimes comic book stores would also get them in from a different distributor. So
I guess what I'm wondering is, as of now, would you say, like, if this was coming out, would you get more orders from comic book stores, or would you get more orders from traditional bookstores?
This one's going to be tough, and we'll see what happens. There's going to be a couple of interesting reviews outside of the comics world for the book. And I think because of its history with Milt Gross, because of his connection with the early days of the Lower East Side Jewish American community. So that's going to be a different audience for that. So it's hard to say. This might make it more into the regular bookstores. Something like White Boy was really a comic books thing, because that's something that comic book lovers have heard about. There's been some exposure. They had seen a couple of pages, but they really wanted to see the entire story. So that was more of a comic book store item. So this one, who knows?
I'll be honest, I was not familiar with White Boy before, but when I looked at some of the pages on the Sunday Press website, I'm impressed, and I definitely want to see more.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. Peter, so what's your next project? What is the great comic strip reprint project like that you've had on the back burner that just hasn't happened?
I got three or four on the back burner that I'd like to do.
Can you hit us? Can you give us a little sneak preview?
Well, I'd like to do all the adventure stories from the Gumps. Another thing that's not really going to sell, but it's something I think is important because it's beautiful stuff that a lot of people don't know about.
I don't know about it. Tell me about what that is.
Yeah, and it's done. The Gumps was a family story, a family comic strip that was mostly gag stuff. But the son would take off on these adventures, and the artwork was really, really, really intricate and sometimes reminiscent to the Little Nemo stuff, or maybe to some of the earlier adventure comics. And so that's one thing that I'd like to see. Another thing I'm working on right now is with Trina Robbins on all of the female heroes in the comic strips of the 30s and 40s.
Oh, okay.
Because before they were just sort of kids or flapper girls, and then by the time you got to the 50s, the women characters were just housewives. But there was that period in the 30s and 40s where they were taking off from the regular roles of school teachers and nurses and really going on adventures and becoming superheroes and detectives and all these really fascinating things that people were seeing in other areas of the comics. And they realized because there was so much real estate in the comic books, comic strips at the time, that there was room for something for girls, some role models for girls as well. And it's an interesting combination of really high fashion glamour and going after crooks and bad guys, sort of put together, because they couldn't lose the idea. They couldn't have these women going around with jeans and sweatshirts. So they were in their high heels and their flowing gowns, and at the same time they were bringing bad guys to justice. So it's pretty interesting stories. So that I'm looking forward to seeing. That'll be out next year.
Okay, great. That sounds now. How much thought do you put into the commercial viability versus, like you said, like this is important? And do you try to alternate between, like, I don't know, there's only so many Little Nemos, and there's only one. right?
Yeah.
You're never like, there's nothing of everything is gonna. That's set the bar very high. You're probably not gonna go above that. But what else
Yeah,
is
everything that's going to sell has already been done or is in the middle of being done.
Yeah.
So now it's just a case of what's really beautiful, what's important that people need to see that they haven't seen. And so I'm focusing on that stuff.
And were there just tons of just like kind of middle of the road, forgettable and forgotten strips from even that era?
90% of everything is junk.
Yeah.
In the comics, it's probably better than that. It's probably only about 80% of it is junk. But that 20%, man, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is, man. And I'm going to say you've done a service to the world, Peter, by bringing this stuff back.
Well, I did a service to myself and the people that I know like this stuff. But yeah, I've gotten a lot of really good response. And that's one of the things that keeps me going. When you get fan mail from someone in the Seychelles that says, this makes my year when I get to see one of your books. And, people in Brazil who send me pictures of their kids sitting and reading the book. There was one guy sent me a picture of his kid when she was 4 years old with Little Nemo open on the floor. And 3 years later, or when Little Nemo 2 came out 4 years later, he had a second baby girl. So the 8-year-old baby girl is reading Little Nemo to the 2-year-old baby girl. And I'm going, this is what it's all about.
I love it. I've introduced it to some kids too. And even if they can't follow the story, because honestly, even sometimes adults have a hard time reading some of the strips, right?
Yeah.
But anybody can just admire them for their just
and at that size, particularly when you're a kid, you just dive into it. You just become a part of those panels.
Yeah, so. It's amazing stuff. Peter, let's go. We're going to go to some Q&A.
Sure.
From the people, the hoi polloi, if you will.
There's people watching this? You didn't tell me that. I would have been nervous.
Oh my gosh, we got 11 people, 22 eyeballs watching us right now.
44.
Yeah, well, no, 11 people, but okay. 22 eyeballs. But we'll get a lot of people watching this over time, I guarantee you. But let's go to some of the comments. I'll go back in time, folks. If you've got more questions for Peter, I'm going to go back and look at some of the older ones that are still around. There's not too many; they expire after a while. But Society's Nick's Forgotten Fantasy. Oh, tell us about Forgotten Fantasies. We didn't touch on
somebody mentioned that because what I wanted to do was after Little Nemo, I started looking. He said, what came before Little Nemo? What else was around that area? And there was so much incredible stuff. I couldn't do one book on it, so I decided to do 2 books. One was the Forgotten Fantasy, which is all of the fantasy-based material, and the early comic strips really came from 2 different areas. One from the illustrated children's books, which were getting popular in the Victorian area as people actually would buy books and toys and things for their children because there was this disposable income all of a sudden in families. And the other side came from newspaper editorials. So I decided to split the book that way. And the Forgotten Fantasy is kids' stories that were basically for children, although adults love them. And that's where the complete works of Lionel Feininger came in. The Little Nemo spoof that was done by George McManus, the thing called Nibsy the Newsboy, and also Winsor McCay's Dream of a Rabbit Fiend.
Yes, one of my favorites.
Something called Explorator, which was the first steampunk comic, an early science fiction Jules Verne type of comic book, the complete run of those. Something called Naughty Pete, where when you look at this, you say, well, obviously Chris Ware read this because this is all the routines that he did and all the innovations that he did with panels. So much of that was inspired by Naughty Pete.
I got to see that.
So you can see all of this stuff that either directly inspired or indirectly inspired modern comic artists came from this stuff that was 100, 120 years ago.
Okay.
So then the Society's Nick came out of the editorial cartoon stuff, because all the newspapers were running political commentary and social commentary, and that's where when they started doing the full color comics, they got artists and themes that came out of those books. The good thing is, now Society of Nick is unfortunately out of print, but the good thing is I got together with Go Comics, was online comics. And I created something called the Origins of the Comic Strips, which has all of the Society as Nicks, all of the Forgotten Fantasy, plus another 100 or 150 things that couldn't fit into those books. So if you really wants to know about how all this stuff came about, you go there and you'll see whatever your popular comic strip, whether it's a comic strip artist now or a graphic novelist, you'll see ideas that they came up with, and you'll find out it was 100, 120 years old. So yeah, gocomics.com, and it's Origins of the Comic Strips.
Great. I'll definitely check that one out. I was going to say, if you were to send out review copies, I know I'm not the New York Times, but I could put it on the $1 Million Comics Cam, and I'm rebuilding. We're building the $1 trillion Comics Cam soon, and I am literally building it to spec around a Sunday Press book. Because if I could handle Sunday Press, I could handle anybody's book, literally.
Great. Well, good. Let me make a note, and then you can send me an email too. And let me just give it to the since IDW is handling all the promotion and marketing for all this stuff. Just give me your mail. Say, here's an online guy who wants to talk about the books.
That sounds fantastic. I would love it.
Great.
Let's go back to the.
Anybody else talking?
Oh yeah, we got other comments here. Peter Maresca. Thanks for all the work you've done. That's nice.
Great. Well, thanks, Weird Dad. That's good to hear. I got a couple of notes that I still have on my stuck up on my billboard. Someone was handwritten when the first Little Nemo came out, and they said, "This is incredible. I have to have it. I don't care. I'm going to eat ramen for 3 months. I'm going to buy this book."
I bought the two. Those are the only two I've got. Although I recently bought. Did you see the collection? There was a book done in the same size, like an homage to Little. I'm sure you've seen it, but it had works by a bunch of different independent cartoonists at the full.
Oh yes, where they all did their own version of Little Nemo. Yeah, I helped those guys. The Beehive books, they're now called, I think. And I helped them out in the early days. I set them up at the printer and explained to them the process of working with the printers on a book that size. So yeah, and then we shared some space in Angoulême when they were first selling the book, and it was great fun. Nice guys.
I've got that one too. And speaking of space, I was thinking I've heard stories from publishers before, or people who publish self-publish, and they go, "Yeah, I got 5,000 copies of my comic or whatever," and they're like, "Oh, and I'm swimming in cases of comics or whatever." Like 5,000 copies of this book takes up how much?
Scary. Like I say, when they're coming into the warehouse, it was pretty scary.
And then isn't it even? I don't know anything about this, but then isn't it even just a cost just to warehouse them? Like until they're sold, you're paying for that space, right?
Sure. The warehouse and distribution gets really expensive. That could be 10 or 15% of the cost of your book.
All right, David Hartman, you already did this, but we'll read this. I'd love it if you go more to the creation of Society as Nicks. It's easily the most eye-opening and inspiring collection for me since the Smithsonian collection ruled my youth. And feel free to chat up Forgotten Fantasy too. You just did. Yeah,
I just did that. But the interesting thing about it, and this is, I always go to Art Spiegelman when I need a title, and I was doing the origins of the comic strip or something dull like that. He says, "No, you need something sexier." He says, "You need something that's going to make people say, 'What is this about?'" So he said that he suggested using the old line from the Katzenjammer Kids, which was not the captain, but the other guy who was a part of the strip, who say the professor or the inspector. I think it was the inspector. And the kids are just wreaking havoc. And he goes, "Meet these kids, society is nicks." In other words, the world doesn't stand a chance with kids like that. And I was thinking that when I look back at the world of comics at that time, there was such anarchy going on because it was an entire new thing that just exploded as a completely new form of popular culture. It sort of invented popular culture as we know it, where everyone can essentially at the same time be enjoying the same entertainment. This is before radio, even before movie theaters. Maybe the only popular thing was dime novels, there was sheet music, but this was all asynchronous. Here, every Sunday morning, from one end of the country to the other, everybody was looking at the same thing. And that became modern popular culture. So there was anarchy in how this thing was, what sort of artwork was going to be done. Nobody knew. The artists were taking upon it themselves. There was anarchy in the distribution and the publication. They were sort of inventing this whole idea of syndicating different comic strips. Do we use characters? Do we not use characters? And even in the content itself, there was anarchy, because in order to appeal to this working class, to these immigrants who were always being spat upon and looked down upon, this stuff became anti-authoritarian, where it was like the kids making fun of the teachers, the people in the neighborhood making fun of the people on the street, the working guys making fun of the businessman and the building owners and the politicians. So all of this stuff became like a mini revolution going on in these comic strips. And that's the big difference, again, between the Society's Nicks and the Forgotten Fantasy. The fantasy stuff was another world. The Society's Nicks was an explosion of exaggeration of what the real world was like for that immigrant population.
Okay. Jabba's Creed says, I love these books, Peter. Thanks for the great collected editions. They're hard to find and pay for sometimes, but worth every single penny. They're also hard to justify the bookshelf space to your wife or significant other. Thank you.
But you understand, in some cases, that's the only way to do it. I did shrink the price, the size down for the Thimble Theater book, because it wasn't as essential to have the full page. For Forgotten Fantasy, for Society's Nicks, for Little Nemo, you needed that size in order to read it and appreciate it fully. By the time you get into the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, a lot of papers were printing them smaller so that they didn't have the really intense detail and the tiny print that was being used. So it wasn't as essential to have them in full size.
What about Dick Tracy? What size is the Dick Tracy?
That's an actual tabloid size, the way the New York Daily News put it out. Some papers did it in full size. Some papers rearranged it in a half-page size. For me, it's a bit of a nostalgic thing, because I was introduced to Dick Tracy in the New York Sunday News, so I like to see it the way the Sunday News printed it.
The tabloid format?
Tabloid format, yeah. The actual tabloid size. The other books that strips that appeared in full size, like Thimble Theater, I put something together sort of in between the tabloid and the full size.
Okay, Will Stalley says, thank you for publishing such great and well-designed editions of these comics. Do you collect other turn-of-the-century ephemera?
My wife has really put a limit on the amount of paper I can bring into the house. So as I find these things that are really interesting, I have like some early Western dime novels, like the Buffalo Bill stuff, some of the detective stories, a few of the science fiction pulps, things like that are of interest, and I'll come across that I like. I'll pick them up. But the only serious collecting I do is to try and complete these runs of the newspaper comic strips. Hopefully someday there's going to be a university library museum that's going to really want to take care of this stuff and take it.
Okay, yeah. Well, what about these guys behind me? Who's this? I forget who. Billy Ireland. Yeah. Right.
They have Bill Blackbeard's collection, which was the biggest in the world. Bill Blackbeard would travel the country with trucks and vans and pick up newspapers in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, when libraries were throwing them away. They had bound volumes of newspapers that they threw on the curb for recycling, because they had this magnificent new thing called microfilm. And that was going to replace the need for storing these huge, bulky volumes of newspapers. And Bill was sharp enough to know. That's why he's called the man who saved the comics, because without Bill, a lot of this stuff never would have happened. And he came out with that. Someone else had mentioned the Smithsonian Institute look at the collection of the comic strips. And that introduced a lot of people to things like White Boy, to things like Polly and Her Pals, things like the Gumps Adventure Stories that hadn't been seen before, and allowed people to get a taste of these. And when I think about books to do, and one of the reasons why I did White Boy, is I would go back and look at Bill's book and say, yeah, this is great. People ought to see this. Let me do it in a way that's bigger and closer to the original than Bill was ever able to do. And I knew Bill pretty well in the later years, and spent a lot of time with him working on on some of the books I was doing, like the Crazy Cat book. So anyway, his collection, 2 semi-trailer truck loads full, went to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, which had gotten their first really great collection from Milt Caniff. They got all of his artwork and papers. They now also have all of the Bill Watterson stuff.
Yeah, right.
All of his artwork, all of his papers, and so they already have all the Bill stuff. So if they got my collection, about 90% of it would be redundant. And
I see. Yeah, and maybe that's a danger actually to keep it all in one place. You know,
yeah. So maybe if there was a place on the West Coast,
I got a spot. I got some room in the garage here. If you want to, we can talk. We'll talk after.
Yeah, we'll talk about getting the temperature humidity control system set up in there. And
okay, we got one more question here, and then we're gonna get out of here. David Harbert asks, okay, you plugged your books, plug some other stuff. What are some other collection or reprint series that you would recommend, whether or not you had a hand in their creation? I frankly, IDW really surprised me in a lot of the cool choices they've made of stuff to reprint.
Yeah, well, that was Dean Mulaney.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that was Dean Mulaney, who really also understands that a lot of the stuff is important, needs to be seen, and even though he's had some flops that didn't sell well, he's done very well for IDW with the Dick Tracy collection, with the Flash Gordon collection, the Orphan Annie collection, and then some things that didn't sell as well, like the Polly and the Pals or the Kangaroo and a few other things. But it doesn't matter because he is mostly interested in seeing great reproductions of stuff that ought to be done. So I recommend looking at the Library of American Comics stuff. The stuff that Fantagraphics does is really pretty nice. All of their collections. They did Prince Valiant for either the second or third time, and this time they did it without doing new color separations. They did using the original colors. And they did a pretty nice job. Okay.
Those are the usual suspects. I thought it was really interesting that you ended up going to IDW. I mean, even beyond the really classic stuff like now, yours is the most classic, but they reprinted, they did a beautiful hardcover Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman. That is that is a treasured part of my collection. I really, really love that comic. And they did just a loving, beautiful deluxe hardcover of it. Mm-hmm. That I never thought I'd see something.
Oh, and drawn in quarterly too. Aside from the Gaston stuff, they do some really beautiful reproductions of Canadian work and European work.
Yeah.
So check out their catalog as well.
Great recommendations. Peter, I want to thank you. You've been a great sport. Thank you for coming.
This has been great fun. I love doing this.
We had a great conversation, man. I learned a lot of things. I wrote down a lot of names and stuff that I want to look up. I want to write to you again because I want to try and talk to some of the guys and you've talked to. So maybe you can help me reach out to a couple of them.
Sure. Get some more people on here.
Okay. So I got to run the closing credits. If you want to stick around, we can chat for a little while. If you've got time. Okay. So give me a second and I'll get us out of here. Thanks again, Peter. All right, everybody. That was Peter Maresca. Was that big fun or was that big fun? I think it was big fun. Right. And how about, speaking of big fun, how about the return of the $1 Million Comics Camp? This excites me more than almost anything, folks. Let me just tell you, I love the $1 Million Comics Camp, and I have been literally working since I switched to this live stream format to figure out how I could bring back the glory that is the MDCC. And thanks to a few technological innovations, we've made it happen. So speaking of making things happen, folks, you've been making it happen as far as subscriptions to this channel. We're coming up on 2,000. We're going to get there really soon. It was not that long ago that I got to 1,000 and finally monetized this thing. And man, what a rocket ride it's been. I put every single penny of that YouTube money right back into technology like the $1 Million Comics Camp. So please keep supporting. Click like, subscribe, join, all that stuff. And what you can get by joining, you get your name in the credits, right? We had names in the opening credits, but hey, for just $1.99 a month, you get your name in the closing credits. Yeah, but who watches the closing credits? Well, people watch the closing credits on this show, bucko, because we've always got a post-credits closing cameo. So I hope you'll stick around and watch them. I hope you'll join and subscribe. And I hope you'll come back next week who have we got? Wow, Keith Knight. Holy cow, Keith Knight. He's been making comics for a long time, and now he's got a show, a television show coming, or a TV show. What an old guy I am. He's got a streaming media thingy coming out on Hulu called Woke that looks fantastic. I was looking at the preview. We'll look at that. We'll look at the trailer. We'll talk to Keith Knight about his decades in indie comics. Won't that be fun? I think it will. It's going to be earlier because he's on the East Coast and he's a big star, right? And so I had to make my schedule fit around his. Anyway, thank you for watching. Check out this closing credits. Stick around till the end, and we will see you when? Soon? Later? Next time.